Hello, everybody. So good to see all of your smiling faces today. My name is Carrie Cooper, and I'm the Dean of University Libraries at William & Mary. And we are very excited today to have with us author Annette Saunooke Clapsaddle to discuss her debut novel, Even As We Breathe, this beautiful book right here. But before we introduce her, I have a few housekeeping items. Just to make the experience the best it can be for all of us. First, you can keep your video on if you like. We love to see your faces, and it's really nice to see people, for especially the author. We've muted your microphones for Annette's talk, so we don't have any accidents or barking dogs. I wish I could promise that that wasn't going to happen to me. We also encourage you to change your speaker view for the talk so that you can best see Annette. And lastly, we will have time for question and answers. So you can raise your hand and we will call on you to ask your question, or you can use the chat box and you can type your question in there, and I will ask the question, or one of my colleagues from William & Mary that's with me will ask the question. So now I'm going to give the floor to my colleague and my friend Danielle Moretti-Langholtz. Danielle is the Thomasina Jordan Director of the American Indian Resource Center, and she is the administrator for the Native Studies minor, and sometimes teaches in the Department of Anthropology. She curates Native American art, and where I best know her from is when she is working with me through her role at the Muscarelli Museum of Art. And so Danielle, I'm going to let you do the honor of introducing our guest and our author today.
Thank you, Carrie. And actually, it is an honor to introduce this afternoon's speaker for the Homecoming Author Book Talk. Our speaker, Annette Saunooke Clapsaddle, is an enrolled member of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, and she's joining us from North Carolina. Annette did her undergraduate work at Yale, but she's no stranger to our campus. She completed an MA from William & Mary in American Studies in 2003, and that's how I first met her. She asked me to be a member of her thesis committee. It was a very interesting MA thesis, and I asked Annette if she wanted to continue on and get a PhD at William & Mary. And I remember what she said. She said, no, I have got to get back to North Carolina. I have things to do. I don't know if you remember that, Annette, but that is what you said. And it's very clear in the intervening years, Annette Clapsaddle has been busy doing things. She served as executive director of the Cherokee Preservation Foundation. She's the former co-editor of the Journal of Cherokee Studies, and she serves on the board of trustees for the North Carolina Writers Network, and teaches English and Cherokee Studies at Swain County High School. In 2011, she generously assisted me with the rededication of the Bradford Indian School on our campus. She's a member of the Bradford Legacy Group. In 2012, Annette's first novel manuscript, Going to Water, was the winner of the Morningstar Award for Creative Writing, and she was a finalist with that piece in the Penn Bellwether Prize for Socially Engaged Fiction in 2014. But today she's with us to celebrate the release of her debut novel titled Even As We Breathe, published by the University of Kentucky. Is a deeply engaging book set on the landscape and embedded in the heritage of the Cherokee people. Welcome, Annette. We are so glad you're here.
Thank you for having me. I am very happy to be here and to be amongst friends. Danielle, it's great to see you. It's been quite a while. So I thought that I would start off today by reading the prologue, even before I talk about the book itself, because I think the prologue sets up not only the plot itself, but especially the setting for the novel, and the whole concept for the novel actually began with what's discussed in the prologue. So I'm going to take a couple of minutes to read that, and then I'll talk a little bit about what inspired Even As We Breathe. About the place, when I take you there or when you find it on your own, just know that what the old folks say is true. This land is ours because of what is buried in the ground, not what words appear on a paper. But also know this, what is buried in the ground isn't always what you think. It's just the beginning. It's the beginning of the story, the beginning of all of us who call ourselves Homo sapiens. Fitting, I guess, that what I found buried, just as I was trying to figure out how to become a man and still be human, was the very thing that threatened to take it all away. Just when I began to see what taking control of my own life might look like, I realized I was not who I thought, and neither was this place. That summer in 1942, when I met her, really met before I, that summer in 1942, when I met her, really met her, before I found myself in a white man's cage and entangled in the barbed wire that destroyed my father, I left the cage of my home in Cherokee, North Carolina. I left these mountains that both hold and suffocate and went to work at the pinnacle of luxury and privilege, Asheville's Grove Park Inn and Resort. I guess I convinced myself that I could become fortunate by proximity, escape Uncle Bud's tirades and my grandmother Leishy's empty kitchen cabinets, just by driving a couple of hours up the road. It sounded good to tell folks I was raising money for college, but the truth was I didn't know what I was doing. I just didn't want to do it there anymore. And if I stayed any longer, I would become rooted so deeply, I might as well have been buried. My plan didn't quite work the way I thought it would. When I got to the resort, I mostly stayed outside, cut the trees, mowed the grass, and helped to dig holes that would sink signs and posts for barbed wire fences. Music occasionally seeped from the ballroom, but was muted by thick, lead-paned windows before one note ever reached the perimeter of the property. That's where I first found the bone. I was on my hands and knees pitching rocks and digging holes. It was just as the inn, like its music, was becoming dulled by wartime restrictions and hushed by lead bullets. The prisoners, who were actually diplomats and foreign nationals treated more like guests, weren't really known to me yet. That little girl, God bless her soul, had barely even stepped foot on the property, and I was still as free as I ever would be. I squatted there by the fence along the boundary of the Grove Park property and grasped the bone by its middle, pointing both ends upward, studying its curvature. A bent bauble for my idle adolescent hands to fidget with in the absence of a ball stick or a soldier's rifle. I can't recall playing with many toys as a child. That's probably why the bone spoke poetry to me as a young man. It was smooth and porous, its slight C-curved angled in motion, calling to be grasped, used, a weapon at least in some primitive function of strength, like a subhuman sight, though innately human, maybe even the very core of humanity. And now, as I recall the moment out loud, it is an embarrassing indulgence of make-believe for a 19-year-old. It's all right to laugh, I don't blame you. Such an extraordinary object to be inside flesh. It is wholly earthen, not sterile or cellular. It was natural in a way we pray our body is not, momentary, seasonal, destined for expiration. The bone had lost its story, petrified into a mere alkaline deposit, transient and nameless. I was immediately spellbound by this calcified opportunity to embrace a remnant of life's existence in one hand, dry it, dust it, preserve it, and listen. Buried by a story, and I was the only one on this earth privileged to hear it. County, it seemed to coo my name like the beautiful girls of my daydreams, the ones who never took interest in boys like me. Just as I was yet to know of a certain beautiful girl's power, I was yet to understand the power that bone would wield over my life. I was yet to know how much more I would risk for her, for it. I am bits and pieces of the people I meet, my teacher once told me. Though more accurately, I am of the people and places and creatures. And so because of that summer and that war and that small hollow relic, I am bits and pieces of a grand estate and a half-tame primate, and a dozen accents and a missing girl and a fearful girl and all the trees and mountains and asphalt in between. And you, well, I reckon you will be too soon enough. Knowing that she is now gone from this earth, all I'm left to do is wonder what remains of her here for me, for anyone who knew or didn't know her. What happens to the memories? How long do they survive? I can see her dancing, head thrown back, laughing. If there's one thing old age has taught me, it's that there are many kinds of love. She taught, she taught me that sometimes we feel many different kinds with one person. And now it seems possible that love is the only thing that will outlive us all, but only if we continue to tell its story. So that prologue originally focused on the bone that is described, and the whole novel actually revolved around the bone from the beginning. I had, as Danielle mentioned, my first manuscript was a finalist for the Penn Bellwether Prize, and I had convinced myself that that would get me an agent and that would get my first novel published, and that is not how that works. So I spent some time trying to really figure out what direction I wanted to go in. I was, I guess, downtrodden from the experience with the first manuscript and wanted a new project. So I did two things. The first thing I did was I went to our local library, or the one in Silva, North Carolina, and they have these small rooms that just have a desk and a chair and enough space to close the door behind you. And I gave myself a writing prompt to write as long as I possibly could about the most simple item or object I could think of. And I keep a quote taped to my desk and also on my banner on my laptop that says, write a sentence as clean as a bone. And some of you may be familiar with that quote. And so I think that led me to my prompt, which was, how long could I write about a clean bone? I had no idea where it had came from. I wasn't sure what kind of bone it was, but I spent the rest of that afternoon writing as much as I could about a bone, and that really led to what the prologue ended up being. So that was one thing I did. And I should say that's a James Baldwin quote that I'm referencing. And so that's one thing I did. The other thing I did was take a workshop through the Great Smokies Writers Program in Asheville, North Carolina. And the title of the workshop was Get Her Done, Write Your Novel. And the instructor was Heather Newton. She's an author from Asheville and a lawyer. And her process was, of course, a typical workshop where we were workshopping pieces, but we had assignments throughout. We were to write the first chapter, the final chapter, a climax chapter, and a synopsis of our novel throughout the course of the writing workshop. And if you have ever tried to write a synopsis of a novel, whether before or after writing a novel, it is the hardest thing on earth to do. But what it allowed me to do was to have structure. So I work full time. I'm a teacher. At this point, I was working at the Cherokee Preservation Foundation, I think, though. And I have two small children. I have an 11-year-old and a 7-year-old boy. And I needed that structure for me. That's my process. It's different for everybody, but I needed to know that when I had a pocket of time to sit down and write, I knew where I was going. I knew where I wanted the novel to end up, and I knew the main parts of the novel. And so that really, really worked for me. So I had this prologue section about a bone, a random short piece about a bone, and I ended up having the overall structure. The bone led me to think about what really makes us humans and what we decide our identity is. So I had these things going on, and the movie Monuments Men had come out, and I know that it was also a book, but I have not read the book, but I did see the movie. And there was an article in the Asheville Citizen-Times that talked about Asheville's role during World War II, specifically the Biltmore House. If you're familiar with the Biltmore House in Asheville, housed some precious works of art during World War II to keep them safe. And there was this really quick paragraph about the Grove Park Inn, this resort in Asheville, North Carolina, that held access diplomats and foreign nationals as prisoners of war one summer in 1942, the summer of 1942. I had never heard that story before. I asked some other people who might be in the know, and they were unfamiliar. So I started trying to find out more information about these prisoners of war that were held at the Grove Park. There have been other authors that have talked about other resorts in the Southeast that held prisoners of war as well. So it wasn't just the Grove Park. So then I also was fascinated that Cherokee, North Carolina today is just 1 hour from Asheville. It took a little bit longer then. And I started thinking about the ideas of citizenship and identity and how all of this plays out in our country. And I certainly am thinking about our contemporary issues, but also our history as Americans. So one of the things that I was familiar with was that Japanese internment camps were set up on Indian reservations out west. And I always thought of the great irony of that and how it works when we determine who is a citizen and who is not, and the spaces that we allow for that. So when people ask me, how did I get the idea for the book? I feel like there are several different things that came into play. There was a writing prompt, there was a structure, and there was this setting, both the historical context and the physical setting, that allowed me to kind of turn up the heat on some questions that I wanted to reach regarding American identity and our past and how it all plays out today. So that led to this story of my protagonist, County, who's 19 years old, and he's grown up in Cherokee on the Qualla boundary. You'll hear me reference the Qualla boundary. Some people know it as the Cherokee Indian Reservation. It's kind of commonly called that. It's technically not a reservation, but operates similar to a lot of reservations. So anyway, County grew up in Cherokee, and he is struggling with what he wants to do with himself, like a lot of the other teenage boys I know and teach every day. And he thinks he might want to go to college, but he was raised by his grandmother, Leeshy, and his uncle, Bud. Both of his parents are no longer living. And so he wants to try to find other opportunities and thinks he can make some money when he goes to work at the Grove Park. He's joined by Essie Stamper, who is a young Cherokee woman who's kind of in a similar boat in terms of trying to figure out what she wants to do and make some money for college. But she has a pretty stable home life. Both of her parents are living, and she's set that she wants to go to college. She knows that she wants to explore life outside of Cherokee. So they develop a really special friendship. one that County's trying to find his way through. He's certainly interested in Essie, who is a beautiful and smart young woman. And so that took the story off from Cherokee to Asheville. And while County is there, he is accused of being involved in the disappearance of a diplomat's daughter. So he's trying to prove his innocence and work out some of his family history in the process. So the novel goes back and forth from Cherokee to Asheville as County is experiencing all this. So I thought I'd show you a couple of pictures just if you're not familiar with the area. And these are not all from 1942, but I think they give you a sense of place at least a little bit. So let's see how my technical skills are. We practice this. If you give me 1 second. Okay, so this is a photograph from downtown Cherokee in 1949. So it's a few years after. If you go to Cherokee today, not a whole lot has changed. It's a little scary how very little has changed in downtown, but Cherokee has long been a tourism center in the Southeast. At least that's what our economy has been based on. In a minute, I may read a little bit from a chapter that talks about the tail end of logging. But other than logging, tourism has really played a major role for us. And so County spends some time at a trading post in the story in Cherokee. Then this is the Grove Park. This is a little bit earlier, and I don't have the exact date on this, but I wanted to give you a sense of the massive structure of the Grove Park, how overwhelming it feels, and also how oddly natural it looks with the rock face and the sagging roof. It is a beautiful structure. This is, of course, black and white, but the roof is red in its natural state. And let's see. And this is from the interior lobby. It's a postcard. There are these massive fireplaces on opposite ends of the Grove Park. And it's been kind of a playground for the very wealthy since its inception. Most recently, the Obamas vacation there when they come to Western North Carolina. So prior to that summer 1942 and after, it's always been a resort for the wealthy. So it's interesting to me that they held prisoners of war there as well. This is just from a 1940s postcard, so I can show you more of the landscape of Cherokee. This is the Mountainside Theater under these hills. A depiction of it looks a little bit different than it's depicted here now. But it's the mountains really cradle Cherokee. And then if you've read the book and are familiar with Leeshy, County's grandmother, in my head looks very much like the grandmother figures I know from my childhood and growing up in Cherokee. And I feel this is a postcard, I believe. This woman really embodies that with the headscarf in all different colors. Just a typical grandmother figure. I think some of my characters, I don't think I could pick a picture out there that represents them, but I think this one does Leeshy quite well. So just wanted to take a moment to share those pictures with folks. So I'm a teacher, so I can talk for hours and I'm also happy to read, but I wanted to pause and see if people had questions so far, and we can be more conversational that way. Anybody? You can put it in the chat or raise your hand or whatever
Okay,
works
raising
best.
my
Okay. Virginia, I see your hand raised.
Okay, yes, I'm an retired English teacher, so I'm familiar. I wondered if you could address the ending of the book, or is that precipitous? I, when you talk about why her grandmother sent her, I know I get the sense that stories are so important. Our stories are all important, but I'm a little confused about who the speaker is.
Okay, thank you.
I think that's deliberate on your part.
There is a hint that, so I've had to reference this before. So I just talked about Lishi, and the name Lishi is the name for a maternal grandmother. So it is, and County says this really early in the novel, says that it's odd that they call Lishi because the character of Lishi is actually his paternal grandmother. And so I wanted to make a comment on how we distinguish family, right? Who becomes family and to what end. And because maternal relationships in Cherokee are so important, for Cherokee culture are so important, the character of Lishi was more of a maternal grandmother to County. So in the end, if you haven't read the book yet, what Virginia is referencing is a letter that is signed by Lishi. That is not that's not the Lishi character. That is the grandmother who, I don't want to give too much away. That is the grandmother who is speaking to her granddaughter, and she refers to her when she opens up the letter.
Right.
Agiusta, so that's granddaughter. Yeah, so it is a grandmother. I won't say which one because I won't, but talking to her granddaughter. Does that answer your question enough?
It does, yes. Thank you.
Any other?
I sure enjoyed the book, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
It was really wonderful, absorbing story, and your writing was just so clear and precise and lovely.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm happy to, while you guys are thinking of wonderful questions for me, I'm happy to maybe read another short section. Let's see. Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about characters other than Lishi that we talked about. I've been asked about how my characters developed. And I mentioned before that County, because I teach high school, County is very natural for me. That voice is very natural for me. I've taught a million counties, I feel like, in my life. But some of the other characters, I spent a little bit more time with and actually started thinking differently about them as I was writing. And Bud is one of those characters. Bud, if I were telling my students about Bud's character development, Bud was pretty flat when I first started writing this novel. And then I realized that everybody has motivations that make them do the things they do. So I rounded Bud out a little bit more. But the chapter I wanted to read is very short chapter. Chapter 2 is one of our first real introductions to Bud and County's relationship, and one of the reasons why County needed to get out. So I'll read from chapter 2 now. Bud had one more job to scrounge up before I left for the summer to work at the Grove Park Inn in Asheville. And though he would never admit it, he needed me. Bud and a few of his cronies had managed to covertly fell several trees following a major storm, but were unable to convince the remaining railroad bosses to haul the load to the lumberyard. The river, with its infinite ability to expand and contract due to cloudburst or man's manipulation, offered the only solution. They would burden the beasts that had been retired to farming life and drag the load to the Tuckasegee River. They'd dam it, anticipating the expected summer rains, and wait for the push. The Smokies had long been a logging economy, ending only with the inception of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. I had mixed feelings on such and probably harbor more distaste for the industry in my later days. But back then, logging was just another way to survive. Bud made what semblance of a living he could out of those woods. As the logging companies dried up, he siphoned every last opportunity they leaked on their way out of town as if it were maple sap. The timber companies used to build great splash dams to push their haul down the rivers into the timber yards. Railroads couldn't do all the work. The rivers and animals, as they always have, bore the burden of man's desire to do things faster and cheaper. I was seated on a stump at a lumberyard, removing my shoes at the edge of an ever-rising pool, watching the rounded, slick logs race down the river toward me. Waiting, my job was to be a river hog. Gas money, Bud reminded me. About time you get off the teat. Yeah, just try and relax, Thomas, a man I barely knew, nudged me. Ain't no big deal. Little did I know I'd hear those words again in only a matter of weeks. Just try and relax. It took me a while to understand why suspicion would feel so much like drowning. I know now it was those words that connected the sensations for me. It was those words that would outlast the men who spoke them. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The log runners, those skilled, balanced men who spun endlessly on the glassy logs, prodding them into alignment, had left with the last whistle. I knew with my foot useless as it was, and well, to be honest, my body useless as a whole, I could never maneuver the way they had. I could swim though. I could swim for hours. Surely I could push the few dozen poles into their stalls from the pool's rim, and if need be, wade among them. I needed the money. Not just to put away, but to make sure I had the necessities when I got to Asheville. Places like that'll make you pay for your uniform before you even clock in. That's how you become more of an indentured servant than free will staff, and I couldn't let that happen. Bud gave no direction on how to accomplish the objective. He told me where to wait, where the logs should rest, and to keep my mouth shut about the splash pool to anyone else. The logs rushed down the river in a collective heap, fast and bulging from the waters like dark storm clouds mounting. I immediately felt my pulse quicken and I turned, momentarily considering leaving this impending mess to Bud alone. How could I corral such a force of nature? It was obvious I would never be able to swim between the poles as I had imagined. I would need to, at the very least, mount them on all fours to float among them. I've tried many times to recall what happened next, but much of it will forever be blackened from my memory. Here's what I know. I was wet, head to toe, submerged in the frigid spring waters. I felt slick bark on my fingertips and managed to pull my torso atop one undulating log until I became nauseated from the pressure against my gut. I found some sort of strength, some sort of urgency that pulled me into a straddle position, and then I made the mistake of trying to stand. This lasted no discernible time because the balance of my memory is veiled by water and darkness and desperation. I've had a similar sensation when I drive beneath a bridge in a rainstorm. There's a brief void of silence, and then everything rushes in. In this case, the void was when my head dipped below the water, suffocating my senses. Logs were coming faster and the pool was rimmed 3, sometimes 5 deep. To reach the bank, I would have had to scramble over multiple rows of huge trees. I ducked beneath the surface as each new wave came, fearful that the next time I tried to emerge, there would be no space for my body, or that space would be swallowed, crushing me. I couldn't see a thing beneath the surface, the water reddened with clay and frayed bark. I was blind. Calling for help was a waste of time. The skeleton crew of men were stationed elsewhere. My survival was my own. I forcefully pushed my legs downward, propelling my torso above the surface as far as I could, like a trout gasping in silted waters. I inhaled deep and sank just as quickly as I had risen. And then I swam. I swam as hard and as straightforward as I could manage, knowing that coming up for air was no longer an option. Logs loomed overhead, blanketing the surface and blocking the sunlight. I swam until my lungs no longer held, and I expelled a burst of bubbles, what I felt was surely my last contribution to this earth. I waited for my body to rise and rest beneath the barrier of wood, having nothing left in me to breach it. And just as my body began to rise, my fingertips sank into soft mud. I had reached an edge. I could stand. I clawed my way up the receding bank until my face rested on grass and air once again filled my lungs. I tried to blink my eyes open, but they were stung by the splinter remnants and fresh light. I am unsure how long I lay there, but it was Bud's voice I heard first, followed shortly by other men's. They were laughing. He was not. Get up, he roared, rolling me over with his boot and pointing the way to his truck. I never saw $1 from that day, and we didn't speak again until I returned to his cabin one last time before leaving for Asheville. This was all I needed to assure me that if I stayed, if I became Bud's dispensable errand boy, I would die young, if not physically, most assuredly spiritually. My father had not died for his country merely to have his son die for someone else's pocket change. So, are there any questions that I can answer?
I have one. How did you know so well what he was feeling? You described it so beautifully. Under there, under the water. I mean, it feels like you must have gone through some kind of similar experience.
Luckily, I haven't. But I will tell you that scene, I really like that scene because it actually may be the last scene I wrote in full. It wasn't, of course, the last one I edited. I needed more of a motivation for County to leave. I needed to up that tension a little bit. And I'd been thinking about that for a while. And one of the things that I do when I'm thinking about a writing project is I mountain bike. And I was on a really cool mountain biking ride with a friend of mine who lives in Georgia, just outside of Clayton, Georgia. And part of our ride went to, I think it's the Chattooga River, but don't quote me on that. I think that's the river that's down there. And it led us there so that we could swim in the middle of our ride and keep going. And we were sitting on a rock, and she said, you know, they used to float logs down here when the timber industry was around. And I just looked at that river, and I knew that, you know, kind of history in our area, but I looked at that river and I thought, gosh, can you imagine if you were stuck in that, what that would feel like? And so I really, you know, in my head wrote that chapter on the mountain biking ride. And then the part about, he says later in life, when he drove under a bridge, that silence. I've thought about that a long time. I always think that's the weirdest feeling when you're in a rainstorm and you ride under a bridge and it just stops for a second. And what a weird sensation that is. So that's where it came from. I've never had, knock on wood, any experiences with drowning, but that does terrify me. And certainly one of the most suffocating feelings. And that's what I wanted County to feel, just literally suffocated being there. So thank you for that.
It was great. It was fabulous.
I see Teresa has her hand up.
Can you hear me?
Uh-huh.
Yes. So as a former William and Mary grad myself and a former English teacher, when I picked up your book, which was recommended to me by Deborah Lewis Smith, who was in a workshop with you.
Yes.
She's my cousin.
Okay.
I was immediately surprised that you chose first person point of view with a male person. For a brief moment, I was like, wait a minute, she's not a young man. She never had. And anyway, how did you make that decision?
Right. Well, as I mentioned, I've taught a lot of young men. And so I'm more familiar than most maybe with that voice, but it was never a choice for me. The story really came to me from a young man's perspective. I knew I needed this young character to experience this life at the Grove Park without some biases and experiences that come later in life. So I knew it'd be a young character. And I have taught so many, and I have relatives who are so super smart, but not in the school smart way, not in the, I'm going to turn in my assignments on time and I know exactly where I'm going after I graduate. But they are smart in so many other ways. And that's always intrigued me about how we treat students like that. Do we see what we should see in our students? And so it typically is my male students, and I'm sure I'm stereotyping in a lot of ways, but it just seems like male students find their drive in general, find their drive a little bit after high school, a little bit later. And so I have a soft spot for that in my own teaching career. So when I thought about this kind of coming of age story and the experiences, it's always been a young man for me. And, I think about if Essie had been the person or a female protagonist, it would have been a very different story because she experienced, and I, in my head, the other female characters at the Grove Park, their experiences were very different from County, and there are all kinds of other issues that would come up being a female in 1942 working in this place. So I've always been comfortable writing from a male perspective. I hope I do it justice. No one's told me otherwise yet, but I think I know that my next manuscript will be from a female perspective. I value female voices in my writing. They're usually pretty strong characters surrounding the protagonist, but that's just the way the story came.
Anna, you want to go with your question?
Sure, thank you. Hi, Annette. I was wondering how your Cherokee heritage plays into your writing in terms of sort of just your perception of characters. I mean, I'm intrigued with that story about the bone. I haven't read your writing before, and then you sort of just touched on it a little bit, but I was curious as to what is next for you.
Okay. Yeah, so I think Cherokee and Cherokee culture is infused in my writing. I was born and raised in Cherokee, and after graduate school returned here as well. And it's important to me because so much literature that reflects Cherokee culture or is, what we pick up when we want to read about Cherokee. So much of it has been written by non-Cherokee authors. And it's important to me to do a couple of things. I mean, first and foremost is to tell an authentic narrative, a story that is interesting and hopefully insightful in some ways, but also works on another level to dispel some of the stereotypes about Cherokee culture. Most native literature prior to, I might even say the 80s, as late as the 80s, was really romanticized native cultures. And I think that there is something romantic about all of our communities. I do think there is magic in the woods, but not because I'm Native American, so I want to hint at those stereotypes that are portrayed in some of the older quintessential Native literature, but also reframe it for what is authentic to my community. And I'm the first novelist from my tribe, so there are plenty of stories left to tell. So right now, my writing continues to focus on the Cherokee community or Cherokee characters. What I'm working on now, probably more so, it's very early on, so all this could change, but it is going to be set in contemporary Cherokee, and I'm taking some of our most significant origin stories and cultural stories, and I'm kind of extracting the values and themes within those and re-envisioning them in a modern context. So what those stories tell us that can be applied to the events that will take place in a contemporary period. So it's actually a little bit closer look at tribal politics too. So I might be run out of town. So we'll see how that goes.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Yeah.
Tracy?
Yeah, this is Tracy Melton. I have a question. I loved your description I love that scene that you read, and I love your description of the background behind it and what brought you to that. I have a question. I'm excited to send your book to my daughter. She just graduated from William & Mary, and she attended an EMT course right outside Silva, and she lives in Hayesville and works at the Chattooga Health Clinic, which is the same as the river that you mentioned. And so I was just wondering, are there some places, and she's interested in getting to know the culture of the region, are there some places that would be, or things to do that would help her sort of see that that world, that part of the country, the same way that you do?
Yeah, I mean, Western North Carolina is, gosh, it's so full of spots to explore, outdoor spots to explore, which is, I recommend more than anything inside. I would say in terms of like an introduction to Cherokee, the museum is really fabulous in Cherokee. It's a museum of the Cherokee Indian. And so I know COVID has changed some things, but so you'll have to look online. I don't know, that how many people
Yep.
are and things like that, but they do often have demonstrators out and about as well. And I think that's always a good starting point. And then it really depends on if she's interested in hiking or biking or water.
She is, yep, outdoorsy. And
Okay.
I think for everybody too, because is the Grove Park still open?
Mhm.
Yes, I just got a gift card from the Grove Park. I'm excited about.
Because I know when I saw your picture of it, I thought, wow, we really want to go there. My wife loves big fireplaces. So I was thinking, yeah, we need to visit there. So it's kind of, and maybe other people felt the same way, but if other people are visiting too.
Yeah, it is a magical place. And then they have, at Christmas time, they have the gingerbread house competition. So Christmas time is really the time to go because you can check that out. So I'm just trying to get to the spa right now. Yeah, but and then Nantahala Outdoor Center, just outside of Bryson City, if she likes kayaking and rafting and water sports, that's a good place.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I have a question from the chat box, Annette. You mentioned the novel that you wrote that you won the award for. Teresa wants to know how you can get a copy of that first unpublished novel.
There is not a copy available. It is, and normally if I had completely given up on it, I would just go and send it. Send you a file. But it is with a certain publisher right now, so I cannot send it anywhere else. So how can you get a copy? If you are a praying person, maybe pray that it gets published.
Is there a premise you can share with us? A little teaser?
Oh, yes. Yeah. My first manuscript is loosely based on the character of my grandfather. So my grandfather is Osley Bird Saunooke, and he was a two-term chief, but also a professional wrestler and was a heavyweight wrestling champion of the world. Yeah, and he ran a souvenir shop later in life. So the novel is, it is fiction. So I do fictionalize some parts, but it does follow kind of that character through his experience. He was in Chicago for a while, wrestling and working for the railroad. And then what it's like to kind of balance that persona of being the Cherokee chief wrestler versus the reality of being a real chief for our tribe, a political leader for a sovereign nation. And so, yeah, that's kind of the storyline there.
Great, thank you. I'm looking for hands. I have a question, but I don't want to. Oh, okay, I see one. Go ahead. Is it Cairo?
Yeah, it's Carolina, sorry.
Okay.
So Annette OCO, thank you so much for coming to speak with us today. I'm from the Cherokee tribe of Oklahoma.
Oh, okay, cool.
So it's nice to meet you, but I was wondering about what you did kind of earlier on in your career to prepare for writing a novel like this. I haven't read it yet, and I'm looking forward to. I have it up on my Amazon right now, but I was kind of interested in how you kind of developed your skills as a writer.
Right. Yeah. So I always tell people who are interested in writing that if you can take part in writing workshops, I think that makes all the difference in the world. So it did for me. I've written since I was little, written little stories, and I have little books that we made in elementary school. But my real development as a writer, I think comes through the writing workshop process. And it's sometimes difficult. I'm from a rural area, so it's difficult to find a workshop that is convenient, that's in person, because I think that's important, except for COVID, when this is all over, maybe. I think it's important to have that interaction with other writers. So I did, the workshop through Great Smoky Writers Program that I mentioned in Asheville, but I also every year go to Hindman Settlement School for their Appalachian Writers Workshop. And that's been literally life-changing, because that's really how this publication came about. And so it's part instruction, and it's part feedback from other writers, and kind of sharing those same questions with other writers. But it also really focused me. I don't know many writers who don't have a real job in addition to writing. And so what we need most is that focus, and workshops do that. And then of course, you have to be a reader. If you are not a reader, you cannot be a writer. I don't care what anybody says. And so I have the pleasure of teaching literature every year to my students. And it always emboldens my writing, and I'll be in the middle. You can ask my students. I'll be reading a passage to them in the middle of class, and I'll go, "Oh," because it solves a problem in my head for my own writing. So just being in the practice of reading different kinds of literature, I think is so super important also. But finding that community wherever you can also helps with the publication process, just because it is a lot of connecting with people.
So I thought, since William and Mary is what brings everybody here today, and we are celebrating homecoming in a different kind of way. It's so good to see so many familiar faces on the call. I can see lots of friends out there. Hello, and so glad to see you. But I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about your time at William and Mary. And did you know at that point that you would be a teacher and that you would attempt writing stories and trying to publish stories?
Yeah, so right after undergraduate, I started my master's degree at William and Mary, and it was almost a blur. I don't know, Danielle was right. I was like in a hurry. I knew that I wanted to come south from, I'd spent 4 years in Connecticut. So the campus of William and Mary, of course, is gorgeous and really drew me as someone who missed the South in many ways. And the faculty, especially in the American Studies department, was really what I was looking for, because I was an American Studies major at Yale as well. So I was used to this really progressive study of how all aspects of America work together and to create change and progress in this country. And so William and Mary fit the bill in that respect. And so my time at William and Mary is very short. Does feel like a blur, but it was also, getting to know folks like Danielle and the Native community in the area was really important to me for kind of expanding my awareness of other Native peoples in the Southeast. And I think I always knew I was going to be a writer. I was in, I'm tickled by Danielle's comment. I was in a hurry. I was ready to get back and do that, and to work for my tribe and to implement everything we talked about. Because, for me, American Studies is largely about how do we take what we know and transform it into policy and action within our own communities. And so, my studies at Yale and at William and Mary just made me eager to get back and do that. And what I've learned, especially in the last couple of years, really, is that my contribution to change for my community is through my writing. So it's through, of course, this fiction, but also I've recently done some op-eds. I did one for the Atlantic about how our tribe has responded to COVID. Things like that are really important to me, because otherwise no one has any idea how we express our sovereignty. Nobody's writing about it. So I think my time at William and Mary really just kind of pushed me along to seeing how I wanted to affect my community and how I could use my writing to do that.
Wow, that's great. It's a really perfect way to end our time with you. It's a pleasure to meet you, and we thank you so much for spending time with all of us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Happy homecoming. Thanks so much, Annette.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.